And those are there to enforce the developers from USA and the Europe, like as long as they deal with the data from the corresponding region, they need to comply with this kind of privacy policy or privacy regulations. And out of those privacy regulations, GDPR is the most oldest one. GDPR is the first of this type of like privacy regulations. So the GDPR, it imposes fines, it imposes obligations onto the organizations anywhere in the world as long as they deal with the data from EU citizens, European Union citizens. And these GDPR laws, they give the individual the right to ask for their data to be deleted, and the organizations, they are obligated to delete the data from their institution or from their companies. If they don't delete those data, if they violate the GDPR regulations, if they violate the GDPR policies, then the European Union they can like fine those organizations, they can fine those like institutions based on the revenue that they generate annually. So we also like saw such incidents in the past few years that like they are fining a big amount of like fines to each of those organizations, big companies. So it is necessary to have automatic compliance checker in place. So that will help the developer to find the missing piece in their implementation so that they will not violate GDPR regulations, so that they will be able to comply with the GDPR regulation. However, like we see like lots of prior wars that they have investigated, they have tried to focus on finding GDPR regulations in the Android app market or the other mobile app market. They try to look at the user consent, that whether they are properly taken or not. They try to analyze the cookies, investigate the privacy policies, and also there are a lot of work that has been going on analyzing the network traffic to investigate that those applications, those systems, they actually follow the GDPR regulations. However, none of those works actually focus on the like the end-to-end system. Like they don't focus on like different programming languages into the space. They only focus on a single platform. In the web platform, what happens is that to check the compliance in the web platform, we need to incorporate multiple programming languages together. Why? Because in the web platform, we can see that like using the HTML, they are getting the data from the user, whereas they process and store the data in the server using the PHP or the server-side code or the SQL programming languages. So that's why to capture how they are actually analyzing those data, how they are processing the data, how they're storing the data, we need to analyze, we need to incorporate all the 4 different languages together to make a final conclusion, to make a final judge that whether a particular application comply with GDPR regulations or not. What makes it very challenging is that this kind of cross-language traversal, cross-language data flows, they are not like easy to analyze. And on top of that, detecting privacy regulations, privacy violations, it makes it very challenging to analyze those different programming languages together. Why? Because they have different kinds of like way of interacting with each other. For example, JavaScript interact with PHP using asynchronous HTTP requests and responses, whereas it interacts with HTML using Document Object Model API, DOM API. At the same time, PHP communicates with the JavaScript using asynchronous HTTP requests, but it interacts with HTML or the SQL using the statement type of like responses, such as like echo or other type of responses. So this kind of heterogeneous data flows makes it very challenging to analyze this kind of GDPR regulations, the data flow analyze, like how they are being flowing across the web platform, very challenging to find that whether they actually comply with the GDPR regulations or not. So that's why our key insight is to like match the behavior of the WordPress plugin to find the representative data flows and control flows, whether they match with a predefined set of GDPR regulations or not. If they match, then mark it as a compliant, otherwise mark it as a violation. So to that end, in this work, our goal is to find the compliance of GDPR regulations across those web platforms, across those web applications. So to that end, like we incorporated 4 different kind of like GDPR regulations, such as security, share, delete, and data access. The main reason is that like we analyze these 4 kind of regulation because they are actually common across other privacy regulations, such as CCPA or the Virginia law. And another thing to note here is that like all of those privacy regulations, they are actually focusing on data processing via the computer program. So we can actually analyze the source code of different programming languages to infer how the data is being flowing to match with this set of privacy regulations from the GDPR law. So to that end, like I will give you a brief overview of how our system architecture look like. So we propose CHKPLUG to analyze automatically that whether a particular applications comply with GDPR regulations or not. So at the very beginning, we have our parser in place, which actually parse and detects the source code from 4 different languages. It generates the corresponding ST tree. And from there, we have our cross-language code property graph generator in place. It works into 2 steps. In the first steps, it generates the code property graph for each of those programming languages. And then it tries to connect all the different programming languages together to infer how the data is being flowing across the full web applications. And then we have our GDPR compliance checker module in place. This module, what it does is that like it actually infers, it actually focuses on those paths, on those graphs that actually starts to process the personal information from the user end, and how that personal information is being flowing, whether they have like the proper encryption, whether they have like the proper security mechanism in the place or not. This is how our GDPR compliance checker module try to match with the predefined set of the GDPR regulations and try to find that whether each of those flows actually follows the GDPR regulations or not. So let's take a look at like how our tool actually works in the real world scenario. So first of all, like we create this kind of like code property graph to infer the control and data flow for each of the programming languages. So we generate the language specific code property graph for each of those 4 different languages. And then we connect all the languages together to infer how the source from one language being, like how the sync is connected to the source of the other language, how those different languages are interconnected together. It will give us the complete picture that how each of those personal information is being stored and processed in the application. So let's take a deeper look at like how actually this code property, this cross-language code property actually works and how it helps us to analyze the GDPR regulations. So I will give you a brief overview that like how those different nodes, code property graphs are connected to each other. So on the top left, you can see that like it's an HTML input field which collects personal information from the user end. On the bottom side, you will see the corresponding ST tree and how the different nodes are connected to each other. First, after it collects from the user end the personal information, then it gives the corresponding data to the PHP where it processes and generates it gives the corresponding data to the JavaScript, and then it processes the corresponding data and it prepares a post request, which then sends the asynchronous post request data to the server side, which is written in PHP. And from there, in the PHP side code, it tries to process that data and tries to analyze that data and generate the corresponding SQL statement so that like it can update the corresponding personal information on the database. And at the very end, we have our SQL statement, SQL language, where it actually stores the data, it updates the data on the server side. So this is how the different different ST nodes from each of those programming languages look like. And after that, we connect each of those languages using inter data flow edges. And at the very end, we capture all those data flows and control flows together to infer how each of those personal information is being flowing across the whole platform, across the whole application. So our tool, our main motive here is to detect that like for each of those stored personal information, whether the application is providing the data, like whether the application is providing the interface to the user so that the user can make requests, user can retrieve the corresponding data from the application, from the platform. So to that end, like we have different ways of checking each of those policies. First of all, if we find one policy, say for example, if one application is storing the personal information, then we try to look at the counterpart. For example, for the data deletion, for the counterpart of the storage is the data deletion part. We see that like whether the pattern is available in the application that provides the data deletion functionality to user or not. If not, then we mark it as a violation. So let's take a let's take a closer look. Here I'm like showing one example pattern of like how we use our query to the cross-language code property graph to infer that like whether a particular application is storing the data or not. So here on the top side, we can see that like the application is storing the personal information using HTML input field. On the bottom, like we can see one kind of pattern where the application may use it to delete the corresponding personal information from the WordPress plugin from the applications. If we don't find such application, such deletion flow in the application, then we mark these applications as a violation, data deletion violation, and we mark it that like it should have this kind of pattern of deleting the data from the WordPress plugin so that it may comply with the WordPress GDPR regulations. So we evaluate our tool on 200 plugins that we have manually labeled. And out of those, we see that like our tool achieves a very good performance in terms of like it achieves around 98% true positive rate and 89.3% as a true negative rate, which determines that like our tool is like performing good in terms of finding those violations across different laws. So now you might be wondering that like how bad does it look like on the real space? How many applications, how many WordPress plugins actually violate the GDPR regulations? So to that end, we perform a measurement analysis where we find that like there is like around 368 plugins violates the data deletion regulations, whereas we find other evidence that like it violates the share and the security policies from the GDPR law. But one thing to note that here, we didn't find any data access violation. Why? The main reason is that the WordPress, if you use WordPress database to store your personal information, then WordPress itself provides the data access functionality to the user. So that means as long as you use WordPress database to store the data, you don't use any kind of like third-party database, then you don't need to provide extra functionality of the data access. So that's the main reason that like we haven't found any violation for the data access functionality. We also break down that like how bad it does look like in terms of which type of personal information being leaked a lot compared to the others. We find that like it's not only related to system related personal information which gets leaked. We find that like some of the personal information which is not system related, such as birth date, phone number, they are also being leaked from this kind of plugins, from this kind of like leakages. So in conclusion, like we have, in summary, we have proposed a cross-language analysis where we can like use our tool to infer how different languages communicate with each other. And we propose a generic framework which automatically detects GDPR violations. With that, I will conclude my talk. Thanks everyone for listening. Now I'll happy to take your questions.
Brian, will you open up? Thank you very much, Brian. Next, I have a question regarding the site. How do you know with the product with each creating them? How do you know you don't product?
That's really good. So we actually label those data by ourselves. Computer science systems. We are not the lawyers, right? We can't say that whether a particular application is or not. So that's why like we have our domain expert in our team. Whenever we find that there is some confusion among us, we consult with the domain expert and we reach out on sections. What it could even that whether a particular activity is violated the law or not. Because like he also like they tell you at the parties and they verifies that okay, this party should be violating the laws on not. And he has like expert that's he has been working on this like that's CCS, so that's what like we treat him domain expert and from his that we create our plan to data that we evaluate. That's the answer to the question. Wait, any further questions? Okay. Thank you for the great talk. Yeah, my name is Murtala. Use send on you. In a framework for if you are running have a was boy, there is legal or this or for. So you don't it code no the was a little setting. Oh, so right now like we are made statements in different languages, but it can be extendable like as long as you see that like we generate the property graph for each of those languages. So as long as they are able to generate the property graph and try to like link to, so it will be extendable to that part. But right now it's not like it is not quite with us, but it can be extendable to the other languages. You just worried we go on this one non-fault. People said. So you check the identification markets on the school right at most of the time for everyone in the price cycle. So any deal with this situation power do not be needed. Sure. That's really a good question. So that's why we actually focus on the what this money. So that gives you both the access at the set code. And that's why like we make an assumption that like we have access to the source code. The reason is that right our that might list that who might be that target user, right? So yeah, the target user will be like the website owner or the what this plugin developer. So that is like they already have access to the source code. And at least they have both the access to the client side source code as well as the server side source code. So that's why like we are able to make a final conclusion that like whether a particular plugin and we find developer variations or not.